Southern Fried True Crime covers cases that are not suitable for young listeners, and there may also be some explicit language used. Today's episode is a case involving sexual assault. Listener discretion is strongly advised. In 1966, the National Academy of Sciences published Accidental Death and Disability, the Neglected Disease of Modern Society. It included a recommendation for, quote, an active exploration of the feasibility of designating a single nationwide telephone number to summon an ambulance. 2 years later, the first 911 call was placed. By the late 1980s, about 50% of American states had adopted the 911 call system. Canada recognized the advantages of a single emergency number and chose to adopt 911 rather than use a different number, thereby unifying the concept and giving 911 international stature. Today, the use of 911 here and similar systems in other countries is virtually universal. But there is always room for improvement. The 911 system must continue to improve along with technological advances. In early 2008, a case in Florida put this issue in the national spotlight. A woman named Denise Lee was kidnapped and murdered despite 5 911 calls while she was still alive and held captive. The breakdown and utter failure of the 911 system to work that day cost Denise her life. But her own heroism and later activism by her family ensured that the 911 system improved dramatically and continues to grow along with modern technology. Welcome to episode 189, The Murder of Denise Amber Lee. When 21-year-old Nathan Lee woke up on the morning of Thursday, January 17th of 2008, he probably thought that this particular day was nothing special. And at the beginning of this Thursday, he would have been right. Things started off pretty normal. That morning, Nate got dressed for work. It was too early for his wife and sons to be up yet. Denise Amber Lee was also 21 years old, and their eldest son was 2, and the youngest just a baby of 6 months. Nate and Denise were high school sweethearts. Back then, Nate had been the popular athletic guy, while Denise was the quiet but sweet bookworm. When Denise shyly asked Nate on a date their senior year, he was impressed. He later told the Portland Sun, "She didn't think I knew who she was, but I remember exactly what seat she sat in." The young couple hit it off right away. Their first date was at an Applebee's Grill and Bar. Denise was so nervous she didn't need a thing. But still, the date was amazing. They both felt they had found something rare, something special, and they were right. By this specific Thursday in January 2008, the young couple had been married for about 3 years. And they had continued to fit together like puzzle pieces, complementing each other perfectly. Where Nate was outgoing and charming, Denise was soft-spoken and kind. Where Nate was eager to work several jobs to keep his growing family financially afloat, Denise was happy to stay home with their young sons. They were building something good together, something great, a family, a community, a future. When Nate opened the door to go to work on January 17th, he was met with dreary weather. The skies were cloudy and sad. Rain threatened, but it only ever drizzled. But this, like everything else that happened that Thursday, was normal. It was typical weather for a cool Florida winter in the city of Northport. Nate always made a point to call Denise throughout his workday. He liked checking in with her, making sure everything was okay with her and the boys. At about 11 that morning, Nate used his cell phone to call Denise, and they spoke for about 5 minutes. He later told NBC News, "We were just talking about, what we normally talk about. I remember asking her that morning to make sure you open the windows, save some money." But Denise was ahead of Nate. She had already opened the windows to make the most of the day's cool weather. Then they hung up. Denise then went to the post office to run an errand. and then she cut their 2-year-old son's hair on the back porch. A few hours later, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Nate got off work, and he called Denise, like always. But strangely, she didn't answer, and Denise always answered the phone. A little worried, but sure everything was fine, Nate went straight home. The drive from work to home took 25 minutes, and in that 25 minutes, Nate called Denise somewhere around 8 times. Later, he would explain to NBC News that despite the repeated calls, he wasn't nervous until he turned onto their street. That's when Nate saw that the house's windows, the same windows Denise said she had opened, were closed. Nate unlocked the front door and rushed inside. His 2 sons were napping together in a crib, and that was odd. They never slept in the same crib together. And Denise was nowhere in the house. She was gone. Nate knew right away that something was wrong. Denise would have never left their 2 young sons alone. And of course, there were the windows. If Denise had opened them, why were they shut? Had she shut them? Had someone else? And if so, why? Nate's mind was racing. In an interview with Dateline, he explained that the windows weren't, quote, shut and latched. They were just like pushed down, like someone pushed them down in a hurry. As he frantically searched the house for any sign of his wife, Nate noticed that Denise's car keys, purse, credit cards, money, and cell phone were still in the house. And so at 3:25 p.m., Nate did exactly what he should have. He dialed 911. Nate's call to 911 would be one of many that day, hundreds of thousands. But 5 of those many 911 phone calls would be directly related to the whereabouts of 21-year-old Denise Amber Lee. Now, maybe 5 doesn't sound like that many 911 phone calls to you. But in this type of case, where all the 911 calls were made mere hours after a woman mysteriously disappeared, where the smallest bit of information could mean the difference between life and death, 5 is a huge number of 911 calls. And one of those 911 calls even came from Denise herself. But despite multiple opportunities for someone, anyone, to save Denise from a horrific end, it didn't happen. Denise Amber Goff was born on the 6th of August, 1986, to parents Susan and Rick. She was the eldest of 3 siblings, including 1 brother and 1 sister. She spent most of her life in and around Englewood, Florida. She had a lot of history there, and so did her family. According to the Port Charlotte Sun, Denise's father's family actually helped settle this area many, many years ago. Englewood, if you don't know, is a census-designated place in the southwestern portion of Florida. Englewood actually crosses 2 counties, Charlotte and Sarasota. Today, it has a population of about 20,000. And it's predominantly a retirement destination. Almost 2/3 of its population is over 65 years old, which makes sense. Englewood is beautiful, right on the beach with plenty of golf courses and parasailing opportunities. The perfect place for someone's golden years. Denise's family was well known and well respected at Englewood, and Denise continued her family's legacy of excellence. She was a studious young woman with a passion for books and math. Denise's high school history teacher described her as whip-smart and compassionate. The teacher said that Denise was the type of person who made my teaching job easy and rewarding. When they began dating their senior year of high school, Nate would often want to spend time with Denise, but she was too busy studying. Nate quickly learned that the fastest way to Denise's heart was through study dates. 3 weeks after Denise and Nate began going steady, it was Valentine's Day. Nate told reporters from NBC News how awkward it was. After all, he and Denise had just started hanging out together. Now, all of a sudden, they were facing down the immense romantic pressure of Hallmark cards and boxes of chocolate. But Nate played it cool. He gave Denise a $40 ring with a heart on it. and Denise absolutely loved it. From that day forward, she never removed her beloved heart-shaped ring, not even when Nate proposed and she began wearing her engagement ring. In 2004, Denise graduated magna cum laude from Lemon Bay High School. And a bit over a year later, on August 20th of 2005, 19-year-old Denise Amber Goff married 19-year-old Nathaniel Allen Lee at the First United Methodist Church in Punta Gorda, Florida, about 27 miles east of Inglewood. After high school, Denise did intend to go to college, but when she gave birth to her first son in 2006 and her second son in 2007, she felt her priorities shift. She found such joy in being a mother, and she decided that's what she wanted to do in her life, to be a mother first and everything else could come second. Denise's family supported that decision. Her mother-in-law, Peggy, said that Denise was, quote, the perfect mom to our lovely grandchildren. And Nate supported Denise's desire to be a stay-at-home mom too, even if it meant he had to take on 3 jobs to pay the bills. Nate told NBC News, "We were going through what most people would say are tough times. You know, we had 2 little kids and we were young. Money wasn't necessarily on our side. But it didn't faze us. We knew we were going to be fine, and we knew we were going to grow old together." At the end of the day, the Lees were not a rich family, but they were rich in love, and that's all that mattered. As Nate and Denise began their lives together, they rented a small home in Northport, Florida. It was about 11 miles northeast of Inglewood, and it was a nice home, even if it was a little too far away for Denise's parents' comfort. Denise's father, Rick, explained to NBC News that both he and Denise's mom weren't big fans of where their daughter's house was located. It felt like it was so far away, out in the boonies. But, Rick conceded, the rent was cheap. And the place was really nice. Brand new, 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. It was, according to Rick, the best that a young struggling couple like Nate and Denise could afford. Funny enough, Nate and Denise actually loved that their home was a little more rural. Maybe they even liked some space away from their parents and childhood homes. That's natural for many of us. Denise's father, Rick, was a police sergeant at the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office. He worked in narcotics for a long while before transferring to the Fugitive Apprehension Unit. Based on Rick's career in law enforcement, it wouldn't surprise me if Denise's father was a little protective of his little girl growing up. And that's okay. He had a right to be. On January 17th of 2008, Denise was taking care of some errands. At around 1:45 p.m., she stopped at the post office on U.S. Highway 41. She walked in carrying a large package. A local resident, Chuck Briggs, opened the door for Denise as she walked inside. And that same local, Chuck, also happened to notice a man watching Denise as she stood in the post office line. The man was standing 4 people behind her, and his demeanor was so off-putting that Chuck remembered him. Later, he would tell the authorities that he believed this strange, staring man was 36-year-old Michael King. Michael Lee King was born in May of 1971. He spent most of his life in suburban and rural areas of Michigan until he went through a rough divorce around the year 2002. That's when Michael decided to pack up his bags and move across the country to Florida. There, Michael found work as a plumber. But sometime in the fall of 2007, he decided he was done with plumbing work. He wasn't fired. He didn't officially quit. He just stopped showing up. But this weird work behavior wasn't new for Michael. He had a hard time keeping a regular job. In the past, Michael had been fired from jobs for lying and stealing work by underbidding his own employers. He was also reprimanded for making inappropriate comments to women. On at least one occasion, Michael had even exposed his genitals to a woman who was breastfeeding her newborn child. There was even an allegation of rape against Michael, though the victim chose not to make an official police report. Which statistically isn't unusual. Studies show that only 16 to 40% of rapes are actually reported to law enforcement. And of those, the percentage that are actually prosecuted is an abysmal 4%. But back to Michael King. The people who interacted regularly with Michael knew he was trouble. He spent too much time in strip clubs. His neighbors often called the cops because he kept playing pranks on them. One woman accused Michael of spiking her beer so he could have sex with her. An old co-worker of Michael's said that he had offered to kill his estranged wife multiple times. That co-worker turned Michael down. Michael's own hairdresser, a woman named Patty Paul, reported that he once showed up for a haircut appointment with a young woman on his arm. At first, Patty assumed the young woman was Michael's niece, or maybe even his daughter. That's how young she looked. So imagine Patty's surprise when Michael and this young woman began kissing. According to Patty, Michael said this girl was 15 years old. Apparently, he had met her on the internet. Despite this incident and other alarming behavior, Michael managed to have a girlfriend. But around December of 2007, they broke up. At this time, he also faced bankruptcy and lost his home. Michael's friends and family said this caused him to act oddly. He appeared dazed most of the time. Sometimes he even looked catatonic, and he was becoming increasingly paranoid. His next girlfriend, whom he started dating in early January of 2008, said Michael was worried that the neighbors were looking through his windows. And that same girlfriend reported that on Thursday, January 17th, Michael seemed fine, not paranoid, not catatonic, just fine. No one is sure exactly how Michael Lee King ended up in the vicinity of Denise Amber Lee. To this day, it's uncertain, and the name Lee appearing in both of their names is just a coincidence. We're pretty certain that Denise did not know Michael. She wasn't a partier, and it's not like she was meeting all sorts of new people while raising her babies at home. And Michael, as far as we know, did not know Denise. If Florida local Chuck Briggs is right about seeing Michael behind Denise at the post office off US 41, then Michael may have only laid eyes on her for the first time ever as she waited in line to mail her package. On that day, January 17th, Michael went to a shooting range in Laurel, Florida. It's just outside of Northport, where he also lived. And he wasn't alone. He had gone to the shooting range with his friend, Robert Salvador. Robert was a handyman. They had met through Michael's plumbing job, before Michael stopped going to work at all. When Michael and Robert arrived at the range, Michael reached under the passenger seat of his 1994 green Camaro. According to Robert, Michael was getting his gun, a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. But Robert stopped Michael from going any further. He explained that he couldn't simply take the gun into the shooting range without a case. But Robert had a spare gun case for Michael to borrow. So then, around noon, the two men wrote their names on the gun range's sign-in sheet. After about an hour, Robert and Michael parted ways. It would have been around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. At this time, Robert continued his day. He went to see a customer, stopped by Home Depot, went to a Checkers grocery store, and popped into a storage facility. He was home by around 5:45 p.m. Where Michael went after the gun range is unclear, but it's likely that he stopped at the post office, saw Denise Lee, and followed her to her Northport, Florida home. And we know this because a woman named Jennifer Eckhart, who was staying with some relatives that lived next door to Denise, told the police the following. In the early afternoon, Jennifer was watching television. From her position, she could clearly see through a window toward the street. And that's how Jennifer watched a green Camaro, as she said, creep up and down the road going very slow. Jennifer watched this green Camaro circle the block 4 or 5 times. Finally, at about 2:30 p.m., she went outside to investigate. She figured the Camaro driver was lost and needed some help. But right then, the green Camaro pulled into Nate and Denise's driveway. Jennifer made eye contact with the driver of the Camaro. She didn't think much of it. It was some guy she didn't know. Then Jennifer went back inside. She thought that the guy in the green Camaro had found his destination, so he didn't need her help. About 15 minutes later, Jennifer watched the Camaro leave Nate and Denise's home. This Camaro that Jennifer saw, it wasn't just any green Camaro, although that's already a pretty distinct vehicle. This Camaro had a black car bra. That's a leather or vinyl casting across the front of the car. People put them on cars to protect them from small debris like rocks or bugs, and because they look cool. Michael's car was a green Camaro with a black car bra. That's too much of a coincidence considering the evidence found later. It's very likely that Jennifer witnessed Denise Lee's abduction. We're not sure of the exact details surrounding Denise's kidnapping. Some reports say that she was cutting her 2-year-old son's hair on the back porch when Michael drove up. Others indicate that she was breastfeeding her 6-month-old son. Denise's husband, Nate, speculated to NBC News that perhaps Denise mistook Michael's 1994 green Camaro for Nate's 1995 green Dodge Avenger. The cars do look similar. Maybe Denise unlocked the door when she thought Nate had pulled in the driveway. But then, it wasn't Nate who walked through the door. As I mentioned earlier, Nate arrived home at around 3:30 p.m. When he realized Denise was missing, he called 911. He told the operator, "I just got home from work and my wife, I can't find her. My kids were in the house and I don't know where she is. I've looked every place." Nate explained to the 911 operator that no money was missing and there were no signs of forced entry. After ending the call with 911, Nate reached out to the one person he knew would have the knowledge, resources, and conviction to help find Denise. Denise's father, Police Sergeant Rick Goff. At this time, Rick had worked in the Charlotte County Sheriff's Department for about 25 years. And earlier that same day, Rick had actually called his daughter. He asked if Denise, Nate, and the kids wanted to come over for dinner that night. When Rick answered Nate's call, he thought Nate was just calling back to confirm the dinner plans. But to Rick's horror, Nate explained to him that Denise was missing. Rick told NBC News, I go, "Hey, you guys want to come over and eat?" That's the first thing I asked him as soon as he called. He goes, "I can't. Denise is missing." And I go, "Nate, you've got to explain what you mean by that." And he says, "I'm telling you, she's missing." As a veteran police officer, Rick knew that sometimes missing adult cases are overlooked. The police could chalk them up to a grown person leaving of their own will and just not telling anyone. But Rick knew Denise would never do that. She would never leave her babies alone. Rick was certain something was very, very wrong, and he knew exactly who to call to get the ball rolling on Denise's case. Rick reached out to Sarasota Sheriff's Department, which was the county Denise lived in, and he also called his own sheriff's department, Charlotte County, and his police chief. Rick contacted all state, county, and municipal authorities he could think of, and every single officer that Rick spoke to was eager to provide him with anything he needed. Within hours after Denise went missing, the search for her had begun. It was, according to the Denise Amber Lee Foundation, one of the most massive cooperative search efforts in the history of the area. Over 300 officers helped in the search for Denise. Charlotte County Sheriff Office Major Mark Harrow told the Port Charlotte Sun the vast majority were there on their time off. We're all someone's child or someone's parent. The police arrived to speak with Nate at his house by 3:44 p.m., 15 minutes after his initial call. Right away, they began canvassing the neighborhood, which is when they spoke with Jennifer Eckhart. And law enforcement immediately put out a request for both helicopter support and bloodhounds. At about 4 p.m., detectives of the Northport Police Department were notified that Denise was missing. By 5:02 p.m., the Northport law enforcement officials had issued a be on the lookout, also known as a BOLO, for Denise and the green Camaro. Between 5:30 p.m. and 6 p.m. that day, Michael King unexpectedly showed up at his cousin's house. The cousin was 45-year-old Harold Muxlow. Michael told Harold that his lawnmower was stuck in his front yard. and he asked to borrow some supplies, presumably to unstick the lawnmower. He needed a flashlight, a gas can, and a shovel. Harold invited Michael inside and made small talk for a while. Then, being a helpful cousin, he gave Harold the flashlight, gas can, and shovel to Michael without a second thought. Harold told the Port Charlotte Sun that once Michael had the items he needed, he was suddenly in a hurry. Michael frantically put his borrowed items in the front passenger seat of his car. Harold figured it was because Michael was running out of daylight and needed to mow his lawn. And then Harold heard a female voice yell from Michael's Camaro, "Call the cops." We now know that this was Denise, doing her damnedest to save herself. But at the time, Harold had no clue who the yelling woman was. At Denise's screams, Harold walked toward Michael and the Camaro. He asked him what was going on. Michael, who was beside the passenger side of the car, said, "Nothing. Don't worry about it." And so, Harold turned around and left. If you're horrified at Harold's actions, you're not alone. His decision here may have sealed Denise's fate. And according to early reporting and NBC News, it might be worse than we imagined. Denise might have briefly exited Michael's Camaro as she screamed to Harold for help, which means that Harold saw Denise and still chose to ignore her. But Harold denied seeing Denise. He said he only heard a woman's screams. But according to court documents, Harold saw an unknown person lying prone in the back seat. These court documents reported that Harold watched Michael crawl over the Camaro's console to push this unknown person's head down. And Harold also saw this unknown person's knee rise up from where they were lying down. It's hard not to judge Harold here. Why would this have been acceptable to him? Even if he didn't know Denise was kidnapped, why didn't he just walk over to the Camaro and ask if she was okay? When Harold's role in Denise's case was revealed to the media, the public was absolutely livid. But according to Harold, the whole situation was far more complicated than it seemed. Harold explained that Michael was known for having, quote, crazy relationships with women. He told reporters, "I was used to my cousin having wacky girlfriends and telling tall tales. So at the time, I thought this was a spat between the two. My mother had told me things his mom had said about him and his psycho girlfriends. He was just a bad judge of women he dated." And as Harold explained to the Port Charlotte Sun, he didn't want to cause family drama by calling the cops on his cousin over a small relationship tiff. However, in the aftermath, Harold understood that a different choice could have made all the difference. He explained, "I have not slept. I keep going over this in my head. I'm having trouble focusing at work. It just haunts me." Denise's father, Rick, understandably didn't give a shit about Harold's excuses. He told NBC News, "I don't know how he did what he did, knowing he's got a young daughter himself. What if it was her in the car? He needs to think of that, you know? Could have been his daughter in that car." And it's true. Harold did have a daughter. She was 17 years old at the time, and her name is Sabrina. After Michael drove away with Harold's shovel and other items, Harold actually called Sabrina to tell her about it. When Harold explained what happened, Sabrina immediately understood what he did not. A woman was in danger. She called 911 as soon as she got off the phone with her dad. It was 6:23 p.m., about 4 hours after Denise had been kidnapped. Sabrina relayed almost all of the information her father told her to the 911 operators. That a woman was being held captive in her father's cousin's car. At this news, the 911 operator wanted to know the location of Harold's house. At first, Sabrina was hesitant to provide the operator with her dad's address. She knew Harold would want to be anonymous. But finally, she told the 911 operator where Harold lived. The 911 operator also asked Sabrina for the name of her father's cousin. Sabrina mistakenly told the operator that Harold's cousin's name was Gary King. After a bit more discussion, she suddenly and thankfully remembered that it wasn't Gary King. It was Mikey King, as in Michael. Later, talking to the press, Sabrina explained how she didn't think. She just called 911. Quote, "It's common sense. She needed help. She was yelling help. If somebody needs help, then you get help. You don't stop and think about it." Slowly but surely, the emergency responders were putting together the pieces of who had abducted Denise Lee. And between Sabrina's phone call and another recent 911 phone call, they had almost everything they needed. And that most recent 911 call? Well, it was made only 9 minutes before Sabrina's call at 6:14 p.m. And it came from Denise herself. When Michael was distracted by talking with Harold, Denise was bound in the green Camaro. There, she somehow got a hold of Michael's cell phone, and she successfully called 911. Denise must have only barely dialed 911 before Michael returned to the car after visiting with Harold. When the 911 dispatcher started asking Denise questions, she couldn't answer her directly. She had to explain to them as if she was talking to Michael. It's incredibly clever and a little hard to explain. I'm going to play you Denise's call. I've only used a 911 call one other time before when it was also critical to the story. You need to hear not only how smart Denise was, but the desperation in her voice as she struggled to control her emotions and was doing everything she could to relay every detail she could.
Hello? I'm sorry. I just want to see my family. Hello? Hello? Please, I just want to see my family again. Hello? Please let me go. Please let me go. I just want to see my family again. Okay. Hello? I'm sorry. Hello? I'm sorry. Please let me go. What are you doing? I want you there. Please let me go. I'm going to call Harold. Hello? Please let me go, God, please. Oh, yeah, what? Hello? Help me. What's the address? What's the address that you're at? Hello? What is the address that you're at? Hello, ma'am? Where are we going? I gotta go up to the mountain now. Up and around where? Wow, you need to see that. That's 4 streets. No, 5 streets over from your house. I couldn't everywhere. What's your name, ma'am? Hello? Please. What's your name? Please, my name is Denise. I'm your beautiful husband, and I just want to see my kids again. Your name's Denise? I'm sorry. Please, God, please protect me. Are you on I-75? Where are we? Please. Please. Where are you at? Can you tell if you're on I-75? I don't know where your phone is. I'm sorry. Can you just tell me where we are? Are you blindfolded if you don't press the button? I don't have your phone. Please, God. I don't have it. Sorry.
Do you know this guy?
I don't have it. I'm sorry.
Denise, do you know this guy? She might have the phone laid down and not hear a thing I'm saying, too. He keeps saying off the phone.
I don't know where it is. Maybe if I could see it, I'll find it. No, sir.
Denise?
What is the story?
How long have you been gone from your house? How long? Do you know how long you've been gone from your house? What's your last name? Lee?
Yeah.
Do you know what street? Your name's Denise Lee? Can you tell at all what street you're on?
No.
Do you know this guy that's with you?
No.
You don't know him from anywhere?
No, please. Oh, God, help me.
What's your address? What's your home address, do you know?
I don't know. Please take me to my house. Please take me home. I'm with her, please.
Can you see, or do you have a blindfold on?
I can't see. Where are we?
Can they turn off the radio or turn it down?
I can't hear you. It's too loud. Where are we? Are you gonna help me? Are you gonna let me out now? Help me.
Then the call ended. I know that not only was that difficult to listen to emotionally, but hard to understand. I'll put the full transcript on my website, which will be linked to in today's show notes. The transcript clarifies most of what we can't hear. A lot of it is what Michael was saying to her, which is grim. What is important is even though it's frustrating to hear the 911 operator say, hello, over and over again, she does begin to understand and is also relaying information to her supervisor. Also, apparently, Denise's abduction had already been in the media, so 911 was wary of hoaxes. The operator says the call is coming off the Northport Tower and also points out that Denise may have laid the phone down and can't hear her questions. But you can tell Denise can hear her, despite the loud music, and is doing her best to answer the questions. But still, I would be lying if I said it wasn't extremely frustrating to hear how long it took 911 to catch on and ask the right questions. And yet Denise answers every question, at great risk, like when she says Lee after she has asked her last name. And when she is repeatedly asked the address where she is, she figures out a way to answer by asking Michael where they are going. He answers for no 5 streets from her house. When the operator keeps asking her address, Denise begins pleading to take her back home, back to Latour, which is the street she lived on. She conveyed so much crucial information, her full name, the street she lived on. She answers yes and no questions as best she could. It is truly remarkable how much she is able to do while managing to keep Michael's phone. Now the people involved in Denise's case had some hope. Denise's father, Rick, listened to the call and verified that it was his daughter's voice. Between Denise and Sabrina's 911 calls, It seemed like the authorities could close in on Michael, find him. Nate told NBC News, "I was 100% sure they were going to get her. And I'm thinking, a cell phone. Well, they can track her. They can figure this out." But unfortunately, Michael was using a cheap throwaway phone, so it had no GPS. All the police could do was see which cell phone towers lit up when the phone was dialed, the pings. But still, now Denise's captor had a name, Michael Lee King. With this new information, law enforcement officers immediately swarmed Michael's residence in Northport, Florida. They forcibly entered the premises, but Michael and Denise were not there. At nearly the same time, between 6 and 7 p.m., Michael's cousin, Harold Muxlow, had gone to Michael's home. Following the suspicious interaction with his cousin, Harold wanted to see if Michael's lawnmower was actually stuck in his front lawn. Upon seeing that there was no stuck lawnmower and no Michael, Harold began to worry. He called 911 anonymously from a convenience store, and he explained that a woman was being held against her will in Michael's car. This was the 4th 911 call. Meanwhile, at the same time all this was going down, yet another woman called 911. This caller's name was Jane Kowalski. But the 4 other 911 calls I've mentioned, from Nate, Denise, Sabrina, and Harold, were connected to the Sarasota County call center. But this 911 call from Jane, perhaps the most important one, was picked up by the Charlotte County call center. Jane was barely over the Sarasota County line, so she wasn't talking to Sarasota County emergency responders anymore. And honestly, this detail shouldn't have mattered to Denise's case. You should be able to report an emergency from any county and expect that information to be relayed to the correct county officers. But tragically, this became one of the most important details of Denise's case. At 6:30 p.m., Jane was stopped at a traffic light on U.S. Highway 31. Michael was stuck in traffic in the lane next to Jane. That's when Jane heard Denise screaming and making other loud noises from where she was bound in Michael's Camaro. Jane told NBC News that she heard, quote, "complete, just terrifying screaming, loud. I mean, I've never heard anything like that. So I looked over at him and I saw the man, and I sort of gave him a look like, what's going on in your car?" Jane watched Michael push something down in the back seat, probably Denise's head. And as Michael turned back to the road, Jane saw a hand rise up from the back seat and bang loudly on the passenger side window. Michael and Jane locked eyes. He knew Jane could hear Denise. Immediately, Jane tried to get Michael's license plate number. As their traffic light turned green and other cars began moving along the highway, Jane drove incredibly slow, trying to get behind Michael. But Michael slowed down too. He changed lanes so that he was behind Jane, making it impossible for her to get his license plate. During all of this, Jane called 911. She gave the operator real-time directions to Michael. "He's on the road this time. I have eyes on him. He's turning here." But the operator who responded to the call sounded distracted. They were speaking to someone else, asking Jane to hold on for a moment. It wasn't like the operator was chit-chatting on the job. Rather, it was as if the operator knew exactly how important this information was, but the chaos of the call center was clearly overwhelming. While on the phone with 911, Jane watched Michael make another lane change and take a sharp left onto Toledo Blade Boulevard, going toward I-75. But she couldn't follow Michael because the traffic had become too dense. The information that Jane provided to the Charlotte County 911 call center was huge. Michael King's exact location with a very alive, very scared Denise Lee in his Camaro. But Jane's intel never made it to any officer. Not Charlotte County officers, not Sarasota County, and not Northport. Only minutes after Jane called, the only people who knew where Denise Lee were the 911 operators who had taken the call. And that is because of a simple miscommunication. It's tragic how simple it was. When Jane called 911 at 6:30 p.m., a 911 call taker picked up. As soon as Jane mentioned there was a woman being abused in the back seat of a Camaro, this call taker realized that this might be connected to Denise Lee's case. So the call taker stood up and yelled across the aisle to the dispatchers to get their attention. Then, the 911 call taker shared what Jane was telling her. Next, the call taker wrote the information Jane provided on a piece of paper. She handed it to Dispatcher A, but Dispatcher A's shift was just ending, so Dispatcher A handed the paper to Dispatcher B, whose shift was just starting. But for some reason, another woman, Dispatcher C, intercepted this crucial piece of paper. At this moment, Michael evaded Jane by exiting U.S. Highway 31. She could no longer see his green Camaro. All the while, the original 911 call taker logged Jane's call information into the wrong database. And the paper with all of Jane's provided information, it was forgotten. In response to Jane's 911 phone call, no officers were dispatched. I don't understand this. Even if they had not connected the call to Denise's abduction, this call alone should have warranted a major dispatch. A woman called and was adamant that she heard a woman screaming and saw her banging on the back window of a car. How could they not dispatch? Later, investigators would realize that there were multiple patrol cars on U.S. Highway 31 at the time, the same road Jane and Michael were on. One deputy even said that he was on Toledo Blade Boulevard at 6:35 p.m. He was stopping at a gas station to fill up. It's likely that Michael drove right past this deputy as he fled down Toledo Blade Boulevard to escape Jane. In the weeks after this eventful night, the newspapers would catch wind of this egregious error by the Charlotte County 911 call center. And it was, to put it lightly, a shit show. The female call center workers involved in the mistake were ordered to do remedial training, put on disciplinary probation for 6 months, and suspended for several days. But the public was not satisfied with this punishment. They wanted someone to be fired. And even though obviously none of the 911 call center workers stood trial in court, the court of public opinion was very hard on them. And perhaps the public was right. Denise's husband Nate thought so. He was also upset that the one call taker and numerous operators and dispatchers weren't fired. He told Dateline that it felt like a coin flip as to whether or not they'd be able to help the next person who called 911. Later, the call taker, who was on the phone with Jane, voluntarily took a demotion and transferred to a different position. It's unclear what became of the other dispatchers involved in this debacle. Charlotte County Sheriff John Davenport stood by his call center workers. He claimed that the situation was chaotic and stressful. Davenport argued that it was unlikely that Jane's call would have changed Denise's fate. He had already had officers in that area looking for a green Camaro, but no one had spotted it. Bob Carpenter, the spokesperson for the Charlotte County Sheriff's Department, said, "We don't feel we did anything wrong." But Denise's father, Rick Goff, who worked for the Charlotte Sheriff's Department, had a differing opinion. He told NBC News, quote, "She was beating on the window so hard and screaming, trying to get help, which is the smart thing to do because by that time she knows she probably wasn't coming back. As far as I'm concerned, we blew it. And I say we because I'm part of that sheriff's office." Okay, back to the night of Thursday, January 17th, 2008. Denise Lee was being held in Michael King's green Camaro, along with Michael's borrowed shovel, gas can, and flashlight. The last person to see Denise alive was Jane Kowalski at about 6:30 p.m. By 7 p.m., the police had instituted mandatory checkpoints at all Northport, Florida interstate exits. They began searching almost every single car in an effort to capture Michael and save Denise. A helicopter flew in the air searching for a green Camaro. Near this time, other officers were speaking to Harold Muxlow at his home. Detectives were obtaining a search warrant for Michael's house. For hours, every officer in this section of Florida was on high alert. They had Michael's Camaro's description and license plate number, as well as the driver's license photos of both Michael and Denise. Deputy Christian Weimer and State Trooper Edward Pope were stationed at Toledo Blade Boulevard near I-75. At about 9:10 p.m., they identified Michael's green Camaro. Right away, the two officers followed the Camaro, and eventually, he stopped. Pope withdrew his weapon as he approached the Camaro. He commanded the driver to exit the vehicle multiple times. As Pope shouted the demand for a fifth time, he explained that if the driver, which was Michael, did not comply, he would begin shooting into the vehicle. Only then did Michael get out of his car. Immediately, Pope noticed that Michael's clothes were wet from the waist down, and he saw that Michael's shoes were covered in mud. Pope also saw that on the bra of the green Camaro, there were multiple hair strands and also an unknown sap-like substance. There was also hair on the Camaro's spoiler, along with some blood spatter. Pope searched Michael's car, but there was no sign of Denise. By 9:30 p.m., Michael was in the Florida Highway Patrol's custody. To everyone's dismay, Michael would not tell the officers where Denise was. Instead, he fed them some bullshit story. The details of Michael's lies were poorly reported, probably in part because everyone knew Michael was lying. The police conducted a clever ruse to try to get Michael to tell the truth. The officers allowed Harold into the room where Michael was being held. Then the officers used video surveillance to record the conversation between Harold and Michael. Still, Michael didn't tell the truth. Instead, he said that he and Denise were kidnapped together. He said that he was blindfolded, and that's why he had no idea where the kidnapper had put Denise. At 11 p.m., Michael led the police to a wooded area near Ballsy Street in Northport. He tried to convince the authorities that this is where he and Denise were kidnapped. Even though the investigators didn't believe him, they dutifully searched the area for Denise. They looked until 2 a.m., but they didn't find her. At about 8 a.m. the next day, Friday, January 18th, Michael Lee King was arrested on the charge of kidnapping to commit or to facilitate commission of a felony. He was held in the South County Jail without bond. At noon that day, the police provided the public with a news update, and that evening they expanded their search for Denise to include nearby cities. Meanwhile, Michael's green Camaro was towed to the Northport Police Department. There, detectives found a dirt-covered shovel in the back seat. Later, Harold confirmed that this was the same shovel he had given to Michael the day before. Forensic experts also found Denise Lee's palm print on the driver's side window, along with the hair strands and the heart-shaped ring that Denise had purposefully planted in the back seat. DNA testing also confirmed that the hair, blood, and sap-like substance found on the outside of the Camaro belonged to Denise. In Michael's home, crime scene technicians discovered what would later be described as a rape room. The specific details of this room weren't released, so I'm not sure what that means, but the authorities did release that they found new and used duct tape rolls in several rooms throughout Michael's house. There were also wads of duct tape with hair strands stuck to them. Some of the hair was Denise's and some was Michael's. Law enforcement also recovered a Winnie the Pooh blanket from Michael's home. It was stained with Denise's blood and Michael's semen. The search for Denise was extensive. On Friday, January 18th, the local officials used helicopters, horses, and all-terrain vehicles to find her. They searched from daylight to dusk. They began the process again on Saturday, January 19th. All the while, many of the searching officers and Denise's family had hope. They prayed that Denise was alive. The Charlotte County Chief Deputy Bill Cameron said, "We are treating this as a rescue mission." But that Saturday, the K-9 unit discovered Denise. She was buried in a shallow grave in a wet, marshy field. The location was next to an abandoned construction site, about a half-mile away from where Michael had been arrested. The officer and his police dog who found her had followed some footprints leading that direction. The police had to dig about 3 feet down before they found Denise. Denise was nude and curled in a fetal position, and she had suffered a gunshot wound to the front of her head. Later, medical examiners would confirm that this was Denise's cause of death. This next part is explicit and hard to hear. Please fast forward about 1 minute and 15 seconds if you don't want to hear the details. Based on the location of the bullet's entry wound, right above Denise's eye, she probably wasn't blindfolded when she was shot. If she was awake, she would have seen everything as it happened. And Denise's eye probably exploded at the impact of the bullet. That's what the experts believed was the sap-like substance on Michael's car. It was Denise's ocular fluid. The medical examiner also found blood in Denise's lungs. That suggested that Denise had been alive for a period of time after she was shot. Additionally, 2 pieces of duct tape were found in Denise's hair. Her wrists were bruised from her restraints, and medical experts found that Denise had also sustained vaginal bruising and anal tearing, both caused by sexual assault, which medical experts believe happened before Denise died. And the semen discovered in Denise's vagina matched Michael's DNA profile. Denise's body was released to her family on Monday, January 21st. Her funeral services were held at 1 p.m. on Wednesday, the 23rd of January 2008, at the First United Methodist Church in Punta Gorda, Florida, the same church where she and Nate had been married 4 years earlier. It was the most well-attended funeral that area had ever seen. Hundreds of police officers attended in support of Denise and her father. Her funeral procession was 30 miles long. Students from local schools stood outside and watched as the procession went by, and people stopped working to salute the hearse. Denise was buried in Gulf Pines Memorial Park in Inglewood, Florida. In lieu of flowers, Denise's family asked for donations to be made to the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office, courtesy of the Denise Amber Lee Memorial Fund. Following the discovery of Denise's body, investigators continued searching that wooded area for more clues that would help convict Michael of his crimes. They didn't want to leave any element of Michael's trial to chance. They wanted a conviction, and they weren't messing around to get it. During the ensuing investigation, a 9mm shell casing was found near the shallow grave King had dug for Denise. However, the bullet that killed Denise was never located, and neither was the murder weapon. But a few hundred yards away from the burial site, a crime scene technician found a pair of boxer shorts belonging to Denise's husband, Nate. Denise was known to wear them, so she was probably wearing them when she was abducted. Michael's semen was found on the boxer shorts, and near the original location of the boxer shorts was Denise's shirt. For 2 days after Denise's body was recovered, Jane Kowalski called the Northport police officials. It seemed like no one had heard of her or her 911 call related to Denise's case. Finally, someone put 2 and 2 together, and Jane's information was recorded. This time, it was put into the correct database. Michael Lee King's trial began in late August of 2009. It was very high profile. Dateline had covered Denise's case a while ago and was re-showing their episode around the time of the trial, and Court TV broadcasted live coverage. King pled guilty to all charges, though at one point he claimed that Denise was shot from a helicopter while he and her were having consensual sex. But that story didn't make it to trial, because of course no defense lawyer in their right mind would have let Michael King take the stand. The prosecution asserted that on the day of January 17, 2008, King probably held Denise at gunpoint with a 9mm gun, probably the same gun he had used at the shooting range earlier. Then, through an unknown series of events, Denise put her 2 sons in a crib together, and someone shut the Lee's house's windows. Maybe it was Denise, wanting to make sure her toddler couldn't wander off. Or maybe it was Michael, worried that people would hear Denise cry out for help, or worried the neighbors would hear those babies crying after being left alone. Then he forced Denise into his green Camaro's back seat. To some, this might have felt like the end, but Denise knew that she had a chance. She was an extraordinarily brave woman and the daughter of a cop. Plus, according to Nate, Denise was a big fan of crime shows like Law and Order. Equipped with her knowledge of crime, Denise ripped out strands of her own hair. She made sure to get the follicle, which is the part of your hair that holds the most DNA. Denise knew that her DNA in Michael's car would help implicate him later on. Then Denise took off her heart-shaped ring and dropped it into Michael's back seat. This was the same heart-shaped ring that Nate had given her back in 2004. Nate told NBC News, "The ring didn't necessarily come off very easily, so it's not like it just fell off. I know she placed it there, and it's the only ring I know she would have been 100% sure I would have been able to identify." Anyone in Denise's life would have immediately recognized the ring for what it was, a cherished gift from Nate, and evidence that Denise had been trapped in Michael's car. After Michael kidnapped Denise, he transported her to his house, where she was bound with duct tape and sexually assaulted for approximately 4 hours. Then Michael borrowed his cousin's shovel, drove Denise to an abandoned construction site, and shot her in the head. In trial, the state played all of the recorded 911 calls made in relation to Denise's abduction, including the one she made herself. I can only imagine how emotionally jarring that would have been for jurors. In fact, the trial court noted the following: "It is most extraordinary and extremely rare that one can actually hear the emotions and the voice of an innocent victim who was doomed to be murdered." The 911 recording of the victim tragically reveals her fear, mental state, her terror, and her emotional strain. One need only listen to portions of this call to comprehend her mental state. The court acknowledges that although it quotes from the 911 call, it cannot, by any means, convey the fear and terror clearly heard in Denise Lee's voice in that recording. During the trial, the DNA matching both Denise and Michael King was explained to the jury, and over 40 witnesses were prepared to testify on behalf of the state. Needless to say, the prosecution was ready. And unsurprisingly, Michael's defense team did not have much to say in response. They pointed out that no one had actually seen Michael kill Denise, and that the murder weapon was never found. They tried to place some blame on Robert Salvador, Michael's work friend who had gone to the shooting range with him on the morning of January 17th. But Robert had cooperated with the police fully, even giving them the guns he had used at the shooting range that day. And no, Michael did not give the police the gun he used at the shooting range that day or any other gun. On August 28, 2009, after 2 hours and 4 minutes of deliberation, the jury found 38-year-old Michael Lee King guilty of kidnapping, raping, and murdering 21-year-old Denise Amber Lee. Upon hearing the verdict, Michael King was emotionless. Denise's father, Rick, said at a press conference, "She was a strong lady who made sure that her children were safe, even though she was faced with adversity. Because of her ability to think on her feet, she was able to provide information to investigators that will help convict the perpetrator who did this to her. Her sons will know that she is a hero in saving their lives." Next came the penalty phase of Michael's trial, where they would decide if he would face the death penalty. His defense attorneys argued that Michael should not receive the death penalty because he had suffered a severe injury as a child. To that end, a doctor testified that when Michael was 6 years old, he was injured in the head during a sledding accident. Afterward, his siblings said Michael's behavior changed significantly. In court, the doctor said that frontal lobe injuries make people more likely to have poor judgment, exhibit blunted affect, take excessive risks, have difficulty regulating impulses such as aggression, and have difficulty separating fantasy from reality. And when that doctor did a PET scan of Michael, he found abnormal activity in his frontal lobe, which could have been caused by the sledding accident. Later, when Michael appealed on the grounds of ineffective counsel, his own lawyers would reveal that this sledding accident argument was a hard sell. One lawyer said she was grasping at straws when it came to finding a medical expert witness who would support Michael on this front. That lawyer contacted 8 different neuropsychology and mental health experts, and almost all of them thought Michael was a pathological liar who was pretending his head injury was worse than it actually was. They didn't even trust Michael's IQ tests, which indicated that he was on the border of having a learning disability. These experts knew that Michael would be motivated to fail the IQ test to stay alive. Plus, there was no proof that this sledding accident had caused any brain damage, personality changes, or intellectual disabilities. Just the word of a doctor who said the accident could have caused those things, and the anecdotal reports of Michael's family. From the very beginning of the trial, Denise's father and many others were hoping that Michael would be sentenced to death. Rick told the Port Charlotte Sun, "I will go to watch them put the needle in his arm. They can't send him there fast enough." On December 4th, 2009, Michael Lee King was sentenced to death for kidnapping and first-degree murder. He received 30 years for sexual battery. It was a unanimous decision by the jury. Immediately following this decision, a Spencer hearing was held. These always happen when a jury recommends the death penalty in Florida. It's the last chance for a defendant's lawyer to offer additional evidence before the judge enters the sentence. In this case, Michael's defense team explained about Michael's bankruptcy, divorce, school history, jail records, and work history. They claimed that these were mitigating factors that should allow him to escape the death penalty in exchange for life in prison. But the judge agreed with the jury. Michael was sentenced to death. Later, in 2017, the Supreme Court of Florida denied his appeal. Even after the trial, it was unclear how Michael found and targeted Denise. Some suspected that perhaps he had done some plumbing work for Denise and Nate, but that was never confirmed, and neither Nate nor any of Denise's other family members recognized Michael King. Nate told NBC News, "I've tried to look at this from every possible scenario and answer every single question, and dug as deep as I could possibly dig, and I had never ever been in contact with this person, ever. And I know Denise had never been in contact with that person ever. It's just scary to think that something that random, somebody could have been following her for weeks, months." Today, 52-year-old Michael Lee King is awaiting his death sentence in the Union Correctional Institute in Florida. If she had survived, Denise would have been about 37 years old today. Her children are about 17 and 15 years old. Nate, of course, raised them both. In the wake of Denise's death, Nate formed the Denise Amber Lee Foundation. He said, "The foundation is there so no other person, family, or community has to endure the pure hell of a similar event. We envision a time when a citizen's first call for help will be answered by a state-of-the-art 911 call center staffed with dedicated and highly trained professionals. A time when 911 will fail no one." As an advocate for standardized 911 operator training, Nate traveled across the United States. He spoke on the Today Show, Dr. Phil, 2020, and more. Today, the Denise Amber Lee Foundation is still active. If you're interested, you can find out more at deniseamberlee.org. Her father, Rick, also decided to make an impact after Denise's death. He pushed for politicians to reform Florida's 911 system through a new law dubbed the Denise Amber Lee Act. Rather than having 911 operator policies and procedures be designed within each separate county, this law would make the training the same across the state. On October 1st, 2010, the Denise Amber Lee Act passed unanimously. Speaking of his late daughter's heroism in the face of such terror, Rick said, "If I was in that situation, I don't know what I would have done. She did everything she could. Denise did everything in her power to save her life." This has been one of the hardest episodes I've ever recorded. It is difficult to think of the horror Denise faced and not feel anger towards the 911 personnel in this case. Unfortunately, that is a useless emotion at this point. We can take solace that Denise did not suffer and die in vain. Her case made major changes to the 911 system in Florida and brought awareness nationwide. Despite the sorrow I feel, I also can't help but think Denise Lee was a total badass. First, she saved her sons' lives, making sure they were safe. Then, she knew exactly what to do, not only in trying to save her own life, but leaving evidence to make sure that bastard, Michael King, will never see the light of day again. We can hope and pray that she can somehow see the good that came of her heroism that horrible day, and know that her actions affected real change that is saving lives. Southern Fried True Crime is hosted and produced by me, Erica Kelly. Today's episode was researched and written by Andrea Marshbank, with additional research and writing by myself, and of course, all editorial opinions are my own. Southern Fried's original music is by Rob Harrison of Gamma Radio, and the original graphic art is by Coley Horner. Today's episode was edited and mixed by Brandon Scheck-Snyder of Southern Gothic and Erica Kelly. If you have any case suggestions, please go to my website and click on the Listener Suggestion tab, or email sftcresearch@gmail.com. Please remember that I do not accept suggestions on social media private messages. The research tab on southernfriedtruecrime.com is the best way for me to get those little-known cases y'all always send me. But please come join our Facebook group, Southern Fried True Crime Fans Discussion Group, where we swap recipes, worship Dolly Parton, and share memes. I much prefer spending my social media time in our lovely group. We do, of course, discuss true crime, not just Southern Fried, but all kinds. But it is still very much a Southern lifestyle group. Our group is a safe and fun corner of Facebook, and by God, we mean it when we say no shit asses allowed. It's not just a motto, it is how we run the group. If you enjoyed today's show, don't forget to subscribe and please tell a friend or rate and review on iTunes. I'm also on all large platforms like iHeart, Spotify, Amazon, Audible, and YouTube. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. Y'all take care.